Okay, let's begin. So, good evening, everyone. Today we are going to be going through some MCQs on emergency medicine. Are you all with me? Please unmute and tell me I'm audible, my screen is visible. Great, Pragati. Thank you. So, let's go to our first question. Which of the following is most likely to be found in aspirin overdose? So basically, they're asking you here about an ABG finding for a patient with aspirin overdose. Aspirin is salicylate. We have done in the last lecture about salicylate toxicity and aspirin toxicity. So the normal values are pH of 7.4 with a PCO2 of 40 and a bicarb of 24. So can somebody tell me quickly what is the ABG finding in a patient of aspirin overdose? Lalita, Pragati, or anyone? What do we find?
Respiratory alkalosis
Okay. And is it only respiratory alkalosis?
with delayed metabolic acidosis.
Okay, very good. So there is a respiratory alkalosis with a metabolic acidosis. So what do you think is the correct answer over here? First of all, for solving this question, you need to know which are the normal values for your pH, PCO2, PO2, as well as your bicarbs. So you know that your pH is 7.35 to 7.45, which is the normal value. PCO2 35 to 45, PO2 of 75 to 100, and bicarbs of 22 to 26. So amongst these, which is showing a respiratory acidosis, is showing a respiratory alkalosis and a metabolic acidosis? Come on, choose. Nobody? Nobody knows which is the correct answer? Lalita, Pragati? Okay, you are going with A. Anyone else? Tell me.
Would be option C, ma'am.
Yeah, so why did you say A first?
Uh,
Just because you read
Misinterpretation.
the pH?
No, yes, ma'am.
So see, you should never read only the pH. We are looking at respiratory alkalosis with metabolic acidosis. But the
Yes.
PCO2 also has to be on the lower side. Lalita, why are you choosing the B option? So the first option is incorrect because you can see that your pH is on the, one second. I'm sorry. So yeah, so the first option is it is showing a high PCO2 also. So there is CO2 narcosis also here. And the bicarb is 24 with a pH of 7.55. So that's not the correct answer here. We are looking at a respiratory acidosis with respiratory alkalosis with a metabolic acidosis. So now when you chose B, so why B? Lalita, why did you choose B? Agreed, the pH is low, it is 7.25. But we are looking at respiratory alkalosis, not acidosis. 7.25 is an acidotic pH, right? With a PCO2 of 63 and a bicarb of 38. How is this your respiratory alkalosis? In your option B, there is showing an increased PCO2 and also your bicarb is elevated. That means there is a bicarb retention in the kidney and it is compensating. This is compensating to make the pH all right. This ABG you will find it in a patient of COPD, but not in aspirin overdose. Coming to our option D, we have a pH of 7.35, PCO2 of 32 and a bicarb of 30. Now with option D, again here it is a primary metabolic acidosis if you see the pH and the bicarb. But the pH should be, furthermore, there is being a compensation, right? So you are not going to consider this as respiratory alkalosis with metabolic acidosis. This kind of a picture you will find it in a patient of DKA or uremia. So here when you're looking at your option C, which is 7.46, definitely there is alkalosis, but at the same time your PCO2 is 22. That means there is a drop in a PCO2 level also with a bicarb of 16. This is a classical blood gas which you see in a patient of aspirin toxicity. Now here we know that the pH is getting alkalotic. 7.4 is a alkalotic pH. And the respiratory alkalosis is not compensated over here. So the bicarb is also 16. If it was compensated, then it was a different thing. But here it is your primary respiratory alkalosis with underlying metabolic acidosis. Have you all understood this? Lalita,
Yes,
Pragati.
ma'am.
Yeah. So going to the next question. I already explained you all the values. Now see in this diagram, just to be very careful, any pH which is more than 7.8 and which is less than 6.8 is deadly. It is death. The patient will not even come walking to you. The patient is going to be dead. Acidosis is when your pH is going below 7.3. Alkalosis is when your pH is going above 7.4. Anything which stands between 7.35 and 7.45 is your normal pH blood gas value. So if you remember the values, then you are not going to goof up in this. Then, now moving forward, now why should you see respiratory alkalosis? Now a respiratory alkalosis is basically happening because there is increased metabolism. Apart from that, there are common situations where you find respiratory alkalosis, like if a patient is hyperventilating, that means they are washing out more of carbon dioxide. Of course, when there is hypoxia, of course, when there is overventilation, if there is a patient who is on a mechanical ventilator, there is overstimulation of your brainstem, as in during pain. So all these things and stress and hysteria, all these things are also related to your respiratory alkalosis. So in these cases, you will find a respiratory alkalosis. Have you all followed? I hope there are no doubts over here now.
Yes, ma'am.
So this is just an explanation. Probably if you all would have even done the MCQs on the website, you would have found this. Very self-explanatory. Coming to the next question, you have a 26-year-old man with a past medical history of asthma who presents to the accident and emergency with difficulty in breathing. He has a respiratory rate of 35 beats per minute. He has a heart rate of 120 beats per minute and difficulty in answering questions. On auscultation, a polyphonic wheeze is heard and SpO2 is 93%. The patient is unable to perform a PEFR, which is a peak expiratory flow rate. The most appropriate treatment. Again, please follow the question what they are asking you. They are asking the most appropriate treatment in this scenario. So is it nebulized adrenaline, IV Maxulf, 100% oxygen, nebulization with salbutamol, or oral prednisolone? So here you can see that you have a man with asthma. Heart rate is tachycardic, RR is increased, and although he's not able to speak and answer all the questions. You hear a wheezing and the oxygen is 93%. So what do you think you want to give to this patient? So you have answered D, Lalita has answered D, and someone has answered C. Okay, D and C. Okay. Anyone else? Pragati? It's kind of a trick question because you need to know which is the British Thoracic Society guidelines when you're solving a question on bronchial asthma. So basically, asthma is graded into four categories, which is mild, moderate, severe, and life threatening. So here you find that the respiratory rate is higher. That means there is tachypnea, there is tachycardia, and you hear a wheeze with an hypoxia. The patient cannot perform the PEFR. So you should know firstly that what are you going to eliminate here? Now, if you ask me, I think all the answers are right? You can give Maxulf also, you can give O2 also, you can nebulize also, you can give oral prednisolone also. But here, the decision making point is that you would not give this patient nebulized adrenaline because adrenaline has no role in treating an acute asthma attack. Secondly, magnesium sulfate is given to those patients who do not respond to any other treatment, you have not been able to treat them with any other. You've given them nebulization and they are not responding to the nebulization. You have given them corticosteroids IV, they are not responding. At that point of time, maybe you would want to give them magnesium sulfate. That also, if it is a life threatening asthma. Here, it is not life threatening. Coming to the option number D, salbutamol nebulizer. Now, again, we know that salbutamol is a beta agonist bronchodilator. Now, these are nothing, but these are not your first line therapy. These are your second line therapy, which you will give if the patient has hypoxia. Definitely, your patient is having hypoxia. So, you can consider giving this, but you would not want to give this where the oxygen levels are normal. And you can consider giving inhaled salbutamol nebulizers, especially when you know that there is a lot of bronchospasm which is not getting resolved. Coming to oral prednisolone, now again it's a steroid. You can give steroid followed by giving oxygen and nebulizer. Once you've given them bronchodilators, and then you can consider steroids. Now, steroids, either you can give them orally or you can give them through intravenous route. Now, coming to the option C, 100% oxygen. Someone answered C as the correct answer. Yes, C is the correct answer. But why? Now, when you are looking at a patient who has come in with the following complaints, and although there is wheezing, there's tachycardia, there is a tachypnea, there the SpO2 level is 93%. So definitely for this patient, the oxygen level is low, and definitely the patient's PEF value will also be less than 33. Now, when you define an acute attack of asthma, you need to keep in mind that the PEF has to be between 33 to 35, your respiratory rate has to be more than 25, and a heart rate which is going above 110, and the patient is not able to complete the sentences. So here, the first thing and the most appropriate treatment would be to provide the patient with oxygen. Why? Because it's an acute asthma 1, plus there is hypoxia. So to maintain, for a patient of asthma, you want to maintain an oxygen of 94 to 98. Why? Because you are trying to correct this hypoxia. So that is why here the correct answer is 100% oxygen. That doesn't mean that all the other options are wrong. You first give oxygen, you give nebulization, you give steroids. If all this fail and the patient goes into life threatening, then you give magnesium sulfate. But nebulized adrenaline has no role whatsoever. Have you all understood?
The patient is having difficulty in answering the questions, and V's and all is there. And though the SpO2 is low, it's at least 93%, I mean, which is
Correct.
not very bad, I guess so.
Correct.
But then without giving nebulizer, can this 100% oxygen be beneficial?
Yes, definitely. So why? Because currently what we are looking at, there is hypoxia. If you all know, hypoxia will always lead to tachycardia, restlessness, and tachypnea, correct? Now you
Yes.
are trying to correct the hypoxia. So for that, you are giving oxygen. That is your most appropriate treatment initially. The first thing that you will do is start the patient on oxygen. Tell me something when you get in clinical practice. Let's take the clinical approach. If one patient comes to you who's feeling a little breathless and you see that probably there is wheezing also, will you go and tell your nurse to give nebulization first, or you will say start oxygen and prepare for nebulization?
Give oxygen first.
So that's how we start with oxygen. That's the most appropriate initial treatment that you will give. Simultaneously, since you know that there is a polyphonic wheeze, you know that you want to nebulize and you want to give steroids later on. So the first thing if they ask you is what you are going to do.
Yes, ma'am. When the patient is unable to perform this peak expiratory flow rate, then what should we consider that flow rate as? I mean, which percentage?
So we need to consider it as a patient who is having a severe attack. So basically, whenever you have a patient who comes in with a PEF which is between, say, about unable to speak, basically your clue is over here that they are not able to answer the questions. So that falls into an acute attack where this is needed. So your patient is having a severe asthma, which can progress to life-threatening one. So at this point of time, you would want to act aggressively.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay. So then going ahead to the next part, next question. So the correct answer was 100% oxygen over here. Yeah. So you have a 42-year-old man who presents with a 2-day history of severe chest pain. The patient reports a sudden ripping sensation at the front of the chest that occasionally radiates to the back. The patient has tried paracetamol and ibuprofen. to elevate the pain but has had no success. The patient suffers from poorly controlled hypertension, and at the last GP appointment, his blood pressure was 167/95. The most definitive investigation is A. ECG, B. Chest X-ray, C. MRI, D. CT with contrast. Okay, very quick questions I've got. Lalita says A, Lenovo says A, ECG. Okay, let's again read the question. 42-year-old male, 2-day history of severe chest pain. There is a ripping sensation in front of the chest that radiates to the back. This is a classical sign. The patient has tried OTC medicines, but there has been no relief. So that means you know that it is not a muscular pain for sure. And there is a history where his BP is not being controlled. So what do you think this is? First, tell me the diagnosis.
Aortic dissection.
Okay, excellent. So do you think in a patient of aortic dissection, you want to do an ECG first?
No, ma'am, CT angio. My option.
Okay, so you say CT angio at this point of time. Others, do you all still go with your answer as A, ECG? So see, remember one thing, there are the symptoms you should know. If there is a patient who comes in with left arm pain, the patient who comes in with some chest discomfort, and the question asked is which is the first initial thing that you will do, then probably ECG can be your correct answer. But here, the question asked is which is the most definitive investigation. So, for knowing which is the most definitive investigation, you need to know what is the diagnosis. As Lalita rightly said, it looks like aortic dissection. Why? Aortic dissection, because aortic dissection comes in with a tearing, ripping pain in the chest, which even after taking pain meds does not resolve. And the pain of aortic dissection is classical. That patient आपको बोलेगा that my pain is radiating to the back, and the patient will have a history where the BP will not be controlled, uncontrolled blood pressure. And that is how you will pick up that this is aortic dissection. So the definitive investigation when you are dealing with aortic dissection is CT scan with contrast. Chest X-ray and ECG don't have enough sensitivity and specificity to pick up an aortic dissection. Of course, chest X-ray tells us some findings when we see. I'll show you the image. MRI also has not a very high sensitivity and specificity, but you can consider doing MRI in patients, especially if there is a renal damage. But in an unstable patient, aortic dissection का patient कभी भी stable नहीं होगा. You don't want to put your patient in a 40-minute MRI. You want a scan immediately. So CT is a better option and best option for this. So the sensitivity that comes with a CT scan with contrast is almost 100%. And it will tell you exactly where is the location also of the dissection, which will help you in your management. And transesophageal echo, again, that is not the most definitive. That you can do it, but that is not going to be done on a regular basis. With the advancement of CT scan with contrast, transesophageal echo has no role in diagnosing aortic dissection by being the most definitive investigation. So if you see in X-ray, probably this is what you can see in an X-ray of aortic dissection. The mediastinum will be widened. There will be some amount of pleural effusion over here. The aortic silhouette will also be widened. So you will not be able to see it very. So the loss of aortic arch is basically what you will see. So if a question is asked where there is a ripping chest pain, tearing chest pain that radiates to the back with a history of hypertension, पहले diagnosis समझो कि diagnosis क्या है. Once you know the diagnosis, then you will be able to choose the correct answer. Followed?
Yes, ma'am.
Going to our next question. You have a 19-year-old woman who presents with an acute episode of feeling unwell. While in the middle of moving to a new house, she experienced an extremely severe pain near the back of her head. She denies any recent traveling, fever, or neck stiffness. Again, the question is, which is the most definitive diagnosis? Take 30 seconds to 40 seconds to understand the question. We have done this kind of a question in few classes long back. Nobody? 30 second, 40 second over. See, CT scan. Okay, you said CT scan. Okay. So, since nobody else has answered, what do we think this is? Now, this is a 19-year-old woman, young woman. Okay. She's felt unwell. And of course, there was some exertion that has caused her severe pain at the back of her neck, which is the nape of the neck. There is no neck stiffness, there's no recent traveling. So automatically you are trying to rule out any what do you say? You're trying to rule out any infective cause, which is meningitis. So less likely. So meningitis you're not looking at, so automatically a lumbar puncture goes. There is no history of fever, so there is no role of blood culture. Fundoscopy, there is no neuro deficit at this point of time that you would want to do fundoscopy, which will tell you a definitive diagnosis. Coming to an MRI scan, again, first of all, what is your diagnosis? Do you want to do an MRI or do you want to do an CT? A patient who comes in with a severe pain, or which is the worst headache, or which is a pain which you say that has appeared suddenly due to exertion. Whenever there is no head trauma involved and the patient has this kind of pain, you should suspect subarachnoid hemorrhage. Now, when you are suspecting subarachnoid hemorrhage, you know that it is caused because of an underlying aneurysm. Now, what happens is that this aneurysm bursts. Once this aneurysm has burst, it is causing damage to the brain and the skull. So, what is your definitive investigations? A CT scan. You will be able to do a non-contrast enhanced CT in this patient to rule out a bleed. You've done a CT, you get your diagnosis as a SAH. And any which ways, when you're suspecting a bleed, a CT scan is always better than a MRI because blood is very easily picked up better on a CT than an MRI. So definitely we know that here our correct answer is CT scan. Do you all understand? Do you follow this? So these are the types of different brain hemorrhages which we see. We have your epidural hematoma, subarachnoid hemorrhage, subdural hematoma, and intracerebral hemorrhage. Now, when the options we saw why we chose the correct answer. Now we should, as I already told you, that we should know that if there is infection, then you would want to do another investigation or send cultures or do a fundoscopy if you are finding that there are signs of raised ICP. But here clearly there is an exertion involved and it is a very severe pain. Usually patients present with a pain which is most severe in nature and it is the worst headache of their life. If they say it is the worst headache of their life, that means it is an SAH. And usually if you do not do a CT initially and a lot of days have passed, after 10 days or so, the SAH gets reabsorbed and you may not be able to pick it up on a scan. Going to our next question. You have a 64-year-old male who presents to the ED with symptoms of right upper limb weakness and slurring of speech. His symptoms started 5 hours ago and there has been no improvement. He has had a medical history of hypertension and diabetes mellitus. The neuro exam confirms a right upper extremity paresis and dysarthria. Rest examination is normal. He has a blood pressure of 190 over 100, a heart rate of 75, with sugars of 135, HbA1c of 7.3%. Your CT, you do a CT because you suspect that there is a stroke. The CT shows you areas of ischemia without hemorrhage. He also takes certain medications like metformin and lisinopril for his hypertension and DM. What is the most appropriate intervention at this point of time? So here, very straightforward question. You know that here this patient has a stroke and bleed is not there. What do you want to give? Here your problematic factors are his weakness, his blood pressure, and his time of onset. Do you want to give patient an insulin? Do you want to give heparin, aspirin, alteplase, or labetalol? What do you want to give to this patient?
Symptoms started 5 hours ago, so can we give alteplase? TPA?
Okay. So what is your patient selection criteria for giving alteplase? So you mean to say you want to thrombolize this patient? B, heparin. Larita, why heparin? No one? You're not thinking? Okay, so let's start with elimination. We already know that our patient has a stroke. It's an ischemic in origin. On neuro examination, there is paresis and there is dysarthria. There is no paralysis. So if you calculate your NIHSS, which is your stroke scale, you find that the stroke scale, the deficit is very less. It's not a very grave deficit. Also, the time of onset is very important. The patient has come 5 hours after this. What is the cutoff that we use to give a patient alteplase? The patient's sugar is 135. I don't want to give insulin to this patient. Why do I want to treat sugar so aggressively? I don't want to give insulin and get his sugars down at this point of time. Heparin has no role in treating a stroke. Heparin is not in the guidelines for treating a stroke. Hence, heparin is out. Alteplase, yes, thrombolysis is an option for treating stroke, but for a window of up to 4.5 hours. If the patient presents from 3 to 4.5 hours of onset of symptoms, only then can you thrombolyze the patient. Plus, who has a very grave neurodeficit. Here, neurodeficit is very less, na? Hemiplegia nahi hai, hemiparesis hai. And labetalol, why do I want to reduce the blood pressure? In a stroke patient, penumbra ko blood supply to chahiye na, because already the blood supply has been compromised. So keeping a permissive hypertension in the initial stages is all right for my patient. They usually tolerate a BP up to 220. I don't want to do an aggressive treatment in getting the blood pressure down. Furthermore, मैं blood pressure नीचे करूंगी और hypoperfusion होगा. I don't want to do that. Aspirin, yes, the first thing as soon as you see loading dose होता है ना, MI के patient को भी loading dose देते हो ना,
Yes,
MI
ma'am.
के patient को
Yes.
भी thrombolize करने से पहले load करोगे ना, कि directly thrombolysis
Yes.
कर लोगे.
Okay.
सिमिलरली यहाँ पे सबसे पहली चीज आपको एस्पिरिन देनी है. क्यों? क्योंकि एस्पिरिन डेफिनेटली मोर्टालिटी भी रिड्यूस करती है. एंड अगर 48 आवर्स के अंदर पेशेंट आया है तो आपका पहला चीज इज एस्पिरिन. हाँ, अगर ये सेम पेशेंट would have presented within 3 hours of onset of symptoms and he had slurring of speech, he had right limb weakness, he had left limb weakness, he had sensory deficit, and it showed a large infarct. Then, if they asked you what is the most definitive management of this patient, then you could have chosen your answer as alteplase because you would want to thrombolize because there is a grave neurodeficit. Here, most important intervention at this point of time. So, with this scenario, your correct answer is aspirin therapy. You are going to give patient aspirin. Have you all understood this?
Yes, ma'am.
Great. Not going too fast, right? You all are following it, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Chalo. Going to our next question. You have a young football player who has collapsed during a game. During the initial evaluation, his respiratory rate is 14, his pulse is 88, BP is 110/70. He seems to be sweating and he's muttering some incomprehensible sounds. What is the most important next step? They are not asking you definitive, they are not asking you diagnosis, they are asking you what is the most important next step. Imagine you have seen this patient who collapsed during a game. कुछ भी game हो सकता है, football हो, basketball हो, cricket हो, and he's just collapsed. So what do you find abnormal over here? And what is the most important next step that you will do? Is it a CT? Is it an MRI? Will you check sugars? Will you check body temperature? Or will you give fluids? Again, use elimination method.
Body temperature, I think.
Okay, you think body temperature, which is D. Somebody else? Anybody? Pragati says C. Pragati, why did you choose C?
Ma'am, because he's already playing in
Correct.
a field where the temperature is already high, so uh, the environment could be affecting his temperature already. Instead, I would go for blood sugar to check his sugar levels.
Understood. So, again, as I said, we eliminate. As you can see, this patient has normal vitals and there is no neurological deficit that is seen. So, automatically CT and MRI is ruled out.
Hello?
Hello?
Class लग गई रुक के करा.
So automatically your CT and MRI is ruled out. Body temperature, obviously he's playing out, so his body temperature must be altered. But there is no signs of temperature which they have asked us. His BP and his heart rate is fine. He's not tachycardic and hypotensive. So I'm not going to give him fluids. If he's a football player who's been playing this game and he's been running around, of course there would have been drop in his sugar levels, which is causing him sweating and muttering some incomprehensible sounds. Don't think that this is a stroke. This may appear because of this muttering that, oh, nahi, ek to collapse ho gaya, it could be a stroke. But this is a stroke mimic. So when you have stroke mimics, you need to know that the first thing when you find somebody muttering, slurring, not waking up, or just drowsy, you should always check the blood sugar levels. So we have something which we call as stroke mimics. The mnemonic is behind. So what do you do here? And what do you check? Of course, you need to check for brain, like you want to check for if there is any compressing tumor, hemorrhage, or contusion. E for epilepsy, you want to see if your patient is post-ictal. Again, this question does not tell you that. Hyponatremia and hypoglycemia, the commonest cause for a patient to have an altered behavior, which can be mistaken as a stroke. Again, intoxication and infection, alcohol or any fever. Again, our patient did not have anything like that. Neurodeficit like a migraine attack or a multiple sclerosis can also mimic a stroke. Dissection and disc prolapse can also mimic a stroke. So here our correct answer is blood sugar, because with a stable vital only muttering, you want to rule out whether the sugars have dropped or not. Probably the patient has had a hypoglycemia because he was playing an aggressive match. Followed? Can we move ahead? Sure. The next question. Now coming to defibrillation. Now once the patient is defibrillated and high quality CPR is in progress, this is all about your ACLS. The first drug you would expect to give would be CPR चल रहा है, patient को पहला shock दे दिया है. What are you going to give this patient? Morphine, magnesium sulfate, lidocaine, and epinephrine. For answering this question, you should first know that what is your algorithm for a cardiac arrest patient. If you know your algorithm, you will be able to pick up this answer in less than 30 seconds.
Epinephrine.
Okay, you say epinephrine. Lalita says D. You also say D. Pragati, what is your choice? Pragati also says D. So correct. The first drug that you give in a patient where first shock has been given, it is epinephrine. So this is an algorithm. This is an updated algorithm, current guidelines. If you can see in this algorithm, we'll quickly go through it so that you all know. When you start CPR, the first thing you do is to give oxygen. You attach the monitor and defibrillator. Definitely, you have two columns if you have a shockable rhythm and a non-shockable rhythm. You have two shockable rhythms, which is your ventricular fibrillation, and you have a pulseless ventricular tachycardia. As soon as you know it's a shockable rhythm, what you are going to do, you are going to shock the patient, hence this sign of shock. As soon as you've given the shock, IV line has been secured, your CPR is ongoing, you are going to give the patient epinephrine. If you do a rhythm check after 2 minutes and you find that your patient is still in a pulseless VT, you are going to shock again, and your drug of choice will be epinephrine. So after that, again, you've done your rhythm check, your patient still remains to be in shockable rhythm, you will keep giving the shock, you will do your 2 minutes rhythm checks. And when you, after your third shock becomes very important. After your third shock comes the drug amiodarone or lidocaine. So lidocaine and amiodarone are after the third shock. So 3 yaad rakho. After your third shock, you will consider cordarone, and after your first shock, you will consider epinephrine. And epinephrine will You will keep on giving epinephrine every 3 to 5 minutes till the time ROSC is not achieved. Similarly, if your rhythm is not shockable, of course, in a non-shockable rhythm, epinephrine सबसे पहले आता है. Shock का कोई role ही नहीं है. Non-shockable rhythm, asystole, PEA, all you have to do is give CPR, give epinephrine, and find out the 5 H's and 5 T, which are your reversible causes, which is your hypoxia, hypovolemia, H-ion acidosis, hypokalemia, hypothermia. Once you find that out, when you do a bedside blood gas and your CPR is ongoing and you know what is your acid base balance, you try to correct that. So in your CPR, you have, in your cardiac arrest algorithm, you have mainly 3 drugs that you deal with: epinephrine, cordaron, and lidocaine. If cordaron, it's cordaron or lidocaine, it's not cordaron and lidocaine. So either you're going to give cordaron or lidocaine, and you are going to continue with epinephrine. So epinephrine is after first shock, and you have your cordaron after your third shock. It's pretty self-explanatory. The algorithm is very important because you need to know the algorithm. There is no role of morphine, magnesium sulfate over here. Lidocaine, yes, but it is after your third shock. Have you all followed this, dear?
Yes, ma'am.
Sure. Going to our next question. You respond to an emergency call at a local grocery store where a woman has suddenly collapsed. She was shopping alone, so you don't have any past medical history available. Bystanders say that she turned around and she fell forward. A worker is doing chest compression, but there is no AED on site. You quickly assess that she is not breathing and you place the pads, because you have reached now as an EMS, you place the pads on her chest. The monitor reveals the following rhythm. What rhythm is this? So I'll show you the rhythm. Then I'll show you the option. What do you think is the correct answer? चलो इतना टाइम नहीं दे सकते, रिदम है. ECG का क्लास तो तुम लोगों का हुआ है ना? C, ventricular fibrillation, somebody said. Others, what do you think this is? C, okay. So, yes, the correct answer is C. It's a ventricular fibrillation. Why is it a ventricular fibrillation? First of all, you need to know that a ventricular fibrillation is a rhythm which comes pulseless. It is a disorganized rhythm. There is no PQRST which you see. So it's a disorganized rhythm. It is a curly hair appearance that you see over here. If you want to compare the other rhythms, so what were the other options? VTAC, atrial fibrillation, and no scenario portable artifact. So this is how your normal sinus rhythm appears, which has your PQRST. This is a wide complex tachycardia, which we call as a ventricular tachycardia, monomorphic VT, because the height and width of the QRS complex remains the same. So it is a monomorphic ventricular tachycardia. Whereas when you are looking at ventricular fibrillation, this is also VF, this is also VF. So we call this as a fine VF and we call this as a coarse VF. So it can be very fine and it can be very coarse. So don't mistake this as, no, this could be something else. No, this is not a VTAC. This is a VFib, because your VTAC will have complexes like this. And this is also a ventricular fibrillation. This is not a torsade de pointes, because in torsade de pointes, you have a ribbon appearance. This is not like a ribbon appearance. Here the baseline, as well as it is showing a very disorganized rhythm. So it is a very abnormal rhythm, and ventricular fibrillation needs to be treated immediately with defibrillation. So the treatment of VFib is always defibrillate the patient, or VFib patient will never have a pulse. Have you all followed?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Going to our next question. We have a patient who presents to the emergency with raised blood sugars and you diagnose as a DKA. The pH is 7.2, bicarb is 5, potassium is 3.6. The treatment of this patient is, do you give insulin 10 units, 2 liters of NS, 2 liters of NS with an infusion of 0.1 units per kg per hour, or injection soda bicarb? DKA का ट्रीटमेंट पता होना चाहिए to answer this question.
Firstly, we'll treat hypokalemia, I think. Option D.
Option D, you want to give soda bicarb?
Yes.
Okay. Why soda bicarb? Reason of soda bicarb, because bicarb is 5. Lalita says C, 2 liter NS with infusion of 0.1 units kg per hour. Okay. Pragati, what do you say? Pragati says D in soda bicarb. So why are two of you all saying D? What is the role of soda bicarb?
Think of the potassium.
सोडा बाइकार्ब पोटेशियम के लिए देते हैं? सोडा बाइकार्ब, सोडा बाइकार्ब में क्या है? Acidosis. Okay, you want to give acidosis. The patient has acidosis. Okay. So what are we looking at here? The patient has diabetic ketoacidosis. That means the ketone production in the body has increased. Now, when your body is making more of ketone, your alpha butyric acid is breaking down so much that your ketone bodies are produced. So when ketone bodies are produced, the body is going into dehydration. When your body is going into dehydration, more acid is being produced in the body with raised sugar levels. And when you test the urine, your ketones come out to be positive. So your acidosis is happening is because of the dehydration that is happening in the body. And your pH is 7.2, your bicarb is 5, and your potassium is 3.6. Why don't you want to hydrate this patient and give insulin? DK है ना, diagnosed है ना, sugars भी तो कम करने हैं. This is a very major misconcept of maximum people. बाइकार्ब कम है, डीके का पेशेंट है, सोडा बाइकार्ब दे दो. There are certain guidelines that we follow. So here, soda bicarb is a very wrong answer. Correction of this bicarb is by providing fluids. There is a regime which we follow. If you have to give fluids to the patient in the first hour, yes, in the first hour, in the first 30 minutes, you will give 1 liter of normal saline. In the next 60 minutes, you will give another 1 liter. Then you will give 500 ml over the next hour. Why? Because you want the ketones out ना. Ketones को बाहर कैसे निकालोगे? Fluid देके. बाइकार्ब देके आप आपका बाइकार्ब बढ़ाते रहोगे, but it has no role right now. Insulin, yes, you want to start the patient on insulin, you will give them a bolus dose and then you will start them on an infusion because you want to maintain a sugar level, a goal of 11 to 14 millimoles. Also, you will check your HGTs, your glucose levels every 30 minutes. If you find that the sugars have gone down below 200, then you will replace your normal saline with a dextrose along with insulin in that. Potassium, yes, when we are giving potassium to that patient, if the patient's potassium is less than 3.5, then you add KCl to the drip. That also, if your if your potassium is less than 3.5, then you are going to give 40 millimoles of KCl. If it is between 3.5 to 5.5, then you will give 20 millimoles. Now, what is 20 millimoles? One ampule has 10 ml, which is equal to 20 MEQ. So you are going to consider 2 ampules in this case. And if your potassium is very high, which is more than 6, you are going to stop the KCl. You are not going to give any correction at that point of time. The causes of decay, whether it is infection, infarction, what it is, you are going to treat that by providing them with antibiotics. You do give patient soda bicarb, but when do you give? Only and only if your pH is less than 6.9. If you see this flow chart, that's why I have shared this with you. There is an algorithm to follow. See, if you all know the algorithm, it makes your life very easy. It is always rapid resuscitation with fluid. You give fluid resuscitation. Of course, you take care of your ABCs. After that, you give them fluids. After fluids, you check your potassium. You do your ABG, you see how is the potassium. Simultaneously, you correct the potassium and start with the insulin. Only and only if your pH is less than 6.9, then you are going to give potassium, you are going to give soda bicarb to the patient. If your pH is above 7.0, as it is over here in this patient, it is 7.2. Acidosis है, but बाबा acidosis को fluid से treat करो ना. आप अगर आपने 1 घंटे में इतना fluid दे दिया और 1 hour के बाद आपने ABG check किया, trust me, your bicarb will improve. Why? Because you're clearing out the ketones. The ketones and the ketones have risen and the bicarb has fallen because of this ketone body production. Hence, hydration is the key. Aggressive fluid hydration in a patient of DKA. Now, supposedly, somebody says, अरे मेरा patient तो pulmonary edema में है, cardiogenic shock में है, उसमें मैं fluids दूंगा कि नहीं? Of course देने वाले हो आप fluids. Fluids, you definitely have Lasix as your rescue. तो ऐसा नहीं है कि DKA का patient with heart failure में आप fluids नहीं दोगे. You will give. Because if there is acidosis, your acidosis and your lactic acidosis is going to get corrected only and only with your fluids. So your fluids are your mainstay along with insulin, potassium, and bicarb is not indicated. I hope that you all take this message that you don't have to give bicarb to the patient of DKA until and unless the pH is less than 6.9. Have you all followed?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you all understand today what we learned?
Yes,
Could
ma'am.
you all solve the questions? Did you all get a clarity in solving the question? How we solve the question or how we eliminate? Today we did a lot of mix. I think last class somebody had told me that you all want a class on toxidromes. Do you all still want me to do that? Then I can plan that for the next class. Or you all want me to go on the CPR guidelines or something with resuscitation? Please let me know so that I can plan accordingly for the next class. We can have a good session on just a lecture on your research or your toxidromes. So what do you guys prefer? What do you think that you all want to learn which will help you solve questions better? Lalita, Pragati.
Tox syndromes will be better, I guess so.
Okay, Lalita says toxidromes. What else? Toxidrome. Okay. So next class I will try and we'll do some toxidromes so that you all get a good idea about toxidromes. Okay, so that would be all for today. I hope you all enjoyed the class and you all learned something new and you all got to know what to do and what not to do.
Yes, ma'am, it was a wonderful session.
Great, guys. Take care. Good night. We'll meet next class for toxidromes.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.